It's a battle of David versus Goliath, and apparently David isn't afraid to go on the offense. On the 6-month anniversary of the pivotal Kursk invasion, Ukraine has repeated its groundbreaking efforts to show Russia that it can play the aggressor too. Ukraine's new attacks in the Kursk region are being reported by Russian military reporters on social media, who have provided video evidence confirming that Ukraine has managed to push at least 3 miles or 5 kilometers further into Kursk. This means that Ukraine has managed to invade Russian territory not once, but multiple times, and has seized more territory in Kursk. It also showcases that the war in Ukraine is far from over, and that Ukraine is only willing to approach these peace negotiations not as a weak defender, but as Russia's equal. And throughout all of that, there are leaks that suggest President Trump has finally managed to draft a peace plan for the war, but it might not work out well for Ukraine, which is perhaps exactly why Ukraine has launched this renewed attack in the first place. But is there anything more hiding beneath the surface? And how did Ukraine pull off this attack? Let's dive into the latest developments in the war and how they could evolve further. We'll start with the details of the advance. There are only a few semi-reliable sources for the actual details behind the renewed offensive, and most of them actually come from Russian military bloggers and social media posters who focus on the war. Leaked video clips gathered from drone footage showed Ukrainian mechanized infantry, or to be more precise, infantry support vehicles, traveling in the area around Fanaseyevka, a small settlement roughly 3 miles away from what was commonly understood to be the front line in the Kursk region. Some military bloggers imply that the Ukrainian advance is even further into Kursk than reported, with estimates that they have reached Ulanok, a settlement that is a further 3 miles into Russian territory. The possible 6-mile advance likely represents Ukraine taking advantage of Russian strategic shortcomings in the region, which stem from its weakened anti-air defenses and somewhat scattered infantry. The former is due to Ukraine specifically targeting anti-air batteries and supply lines not only in the Kursk region, but in all the regions neighboring Ukraine. This was achieved by Ukraine leveraging its novel long-range capabilities, stemming both from years of drone advancement and vital US and NATO donations. One of the latest such examples was in November, when an ATACMS missile damaged or even possibly destroyed an S-400 battery in the Kursk region. This came from a statement issued by the Russian Ministry of Defense, which is a rare admission to get from a country that notoriously underreports the true state of its military progress and losses. The S-400 is considered one of the most modern anti-air systems currently in use, at least in notable numbers. Russia has used the S-300, S-400, and even possibly its successor, the S-500, in the war in Ukraine. The modern anti-air defense system has enough range to detect long-range ballistic missiles and shorter-range missiles like the ATACMS, with highly advanced cybersecurity systems to prevent spoofing. And these systems tended to work efficiently more often than not, as multiple reports of widespread long-range drone attacks were reported to have a hit rate of around 10% at most. But the few attacks that did manage to strike their intended target were clearly effective in removing some of Russia's crucial defenses in the region. As such, Ukraine has managed to deal heavy blows, not only to the Russian military but to its industry. In late January, a few long-range drones managed to strike the vital Nizhny Novgorod oil refinery, located in central Russia. The refinery, which was 520 miles away from the Ukrainian border, represented about 5% of Russia's total oil refining capacity. Together with other attacks on similar targets, it was estimated that the Ukrainian long-range drones reduced Russia's petroleum product output by at least 10%, which will have both short and long-term ramifications for the energy industry. The scale of Russia's lacking anti-air defenses in Kursk and the surrounding regions was already evident before the newest strike a few days ago. Due to the aforementioned long-range strikes, Russia was forced to withdraw some of its defensive systems from Crimea. This has 2 notable implications for the state of the war. First, the fact that Russia has pulled out some of its anti-air defensive systems means that it's likely lacking them in areas where they're most needed, such as Kursk. This showcases just how little effect Russia's counteroffensive in the region has had. Remember, Russia technically started the counteroffensive all the way back in September 2024, roughly 6 weeks after Ukraine entered Kursk for the first time. Progress on that counteroffensive was debatable at best, as Russia claimed to have liberated small villages and called it a significant success. According to some sources, Russia hasn't managed to retake half of the territory Ukraine occupied in Kursk. This could indicate a near-total collapse of the local forces to mount a serious offensive effort. Remember, while the Kursk offensive and the subsequent counteroffensive were underway, Russia was still making some headway on the main front line in Donbass. That showcases that Russia severely underestimated how much effort, equipment, and strategy Ukraine has invested into making sure that Kursk would be occupied for longer than a month or two. This is also supported by the news that Russia forced the North Korean troops to withdraw from Kursk. North Korea sent around 11,000 soldiers all the way back in October to Kursk. While the news reports at the time suggested that this was a solid fighting force that shouldn't be underestimated, the actual results were anything but impressive. Pretty much every instance of Ukrainians encountering North Koreans on the battlefield ended up with the latter being ridiculed for their lack of combat preparedness, access to modern equipment, and awareness of the prevalence of drone warfare throughout the war in Ukraine. The North Korean troops experienced a few notable setbacks in Kursk, from a lack of training with modern armor and associated tactics to the language barriers that existed between them and the native Russian forces. In some cases, the misunderstanding got so bad that North Koreans fired upon friendly Chechen reinforcements in what should have been a considerable push to retake some of the key territory in Kursk. Instead, the entire action was a resounding failure and showcased the possible ineptitude of the North Korean forces overall. But it's not like the Russians haven't committed their own instances of mistaken identity. When North Korean troops deployed one of their few anti-air defense systems, a model that was reverse-engineered from Soviet-era equipment and mounted onto a unique chassis, the Russian drone operators destroyed it due to mistakenly thinking it belonged to Ukraine. Previously, the North Korean troops were believed to have a reasonable chance of succeeding in whatever goal Putin set out for the counteroffensive. Instead, out of the 11,000 or so troops that were deployed to Kursk, roughly 3,000 were injured or killed in the line of battle, and a few abandoned their posts or were captured by Ukrainians. Overall, the addition of the North Koreans likely only prolonged the misery that ended up being the Russian counteroffensive, as it failed to make significant ground and only added to the increasing pile of casualties the Russian military suffered throughout the war. The withdrawal of the North Koreans from Kursk therefore indicates pretty clearly that Putin doesn't really have a good idea of what to do to expel the Ukrainian military from the area. But it's the second implication of the lack of anti-air defenses that might be even more important. You see, North Koreans being deployed to Kursk is only a symptom of a bigger problem that Russia seems to have, and that is a highly probable lack of manpower and equipment. Apparently, the Ukrainian incursion of Kursk 6 months ago wasn't done only to show that Ukraine could be the aggressor, it also forced Russia to split its forces. Then there's also a third reason, which correlates with peace deals, but we'll get to that one a bit later. Now, Ukraine has been at a pretty significant numerical disadvantage throughout the conflict. At the start of the war, it was estimated that it had only half the manpower and roughly a tenth to a fifth of the military equipment that Russia possessed. And while the NATO donations allowed Ukraine to compensate for the latter category, the former couldn't really be helped. Russia has roughly 3 times the population of Ukraine, so it has a much larger pool from which to pull recruits. And yet, the current estimates suggest that Ukraine has somewhat bridged the gap in the number of troops. Of course, this can be explained by the widespread drafting that's going on in the country as people take up arms to defend their nation against an invasion, but it could also be explained by Russia suffering a colossal number of losses during the war. Current reports by the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense suggest that Russia has incurred over 850,000 casualties, meaning deaths and debilitating injuries combined. At the start of the war, Russia's total active military power around Ukraine was around 150,000 to 200,000. Even if we take the upper estimate to be more correct, Russia has essentially turned over the people fighting on the front lines at least 4 times. With this rate of loss, it's undeniable that Russia is suffering from a significant lack of trained personnel and morale. This is only compounded by the Russian economy also taking a beating at the same time. With a significant number of soldiers being drafted, some estimates go as far as suggesting over 300,000 per year, there are hardly enough people to work domestic jobs to satisfy the country's industrial, manufacturing, and even agricultural needs. The problem further escalates if Russia decides to import pretty much everything it can to spare the industrial manpower for war. If that happens, prices will only keep on going up. In response, the Russian military will have to increase the salary of the soldiers and the premium the family receives in case of their deaths, which only serves to drain the country's coffers even more. It's practically a never-ending circle of losing money to fuel the endless meat grinder on the front. The most reasonable explanation for the North Korean tactic, if it can be called as such, is that those troops were used solely because they were less expensive to organize and maintain than native Russians. In essence, Putin knew that the North Koreans were rubbish at fighting a modern war, but he didn't really care. So long as Russia could present itself as having a numerical advantage, that's all that mattered. Or at least, that was the original plan. With such little progress in Kursk, it's likely that Putin's losses only grew as a result of the ineffective campaigns and poorly executed strategies. And this is exactly what Ukraine wanted to achieve with the invasion of Kursk. It provided enough of a distraction for the Russian forces that they were forced to reorganize. This cost Russia the initiative on the Donbass front line. By having to start resupplying an entirely different front, Russia needed to spend even more time, money, and people on the war. In contrast, the Ukrainian invading forces needed very little to start the incursion, as it happened relatively close to the territory they had already amassed with troops. What did end up being surprising was the sheer success of the invasion. While Ukraine likely predicted this, it was strange that Russia barely defended the border between the two countries, and what little troops were there were likely inexperienced recruits and conscripts. This led to a wave of surrenders at the start of the invasion that brought Ukraine far deeper into Russia's territory than was previously considered possible. Worse yet, Russians didn't want to admit that it was losing the fight in Kursk. It didn't report on the events truthfully, leading to a gross underreaction by the Kremlin and likely a significant lack of resources invested into the counteroffensive in the first few weeks. But if Ukraine had managed to get significant wins solely by invading, occupying, and then holding the territory in Kursk, why did it bother making another major offensive in the same area? The answer likely ties into the third and final reason why Ukraine started the invasion in the first place, and the recent events that brought it to the forefront. When the invasion happened in August, Ukraine was already slightly under pressure by NATO and its allies to try and close out the war peacefully. Of course, nobody was approaching these peace talks just yet, as both sides claimed the other was refusing to negotiate. This led to a joint proposal by China and Brazil that features an atrocious deal for Ukraine. In that deal, Russia would take control of all the territory it's managed to occupy and which was claimed to be freed from Ukraine, and all Ukraine would get in return was a ceasefire. Even worse, there was no concrete deal for how long the ceasefire would last, making the deal a hard pass for Ukraine. But the subtext behind the deal was pretty clear. Ukraine was still considered likely to lose the war in the upcoming year. So Ukraine needed to prove to the world that there was still much more it could do than simply defend against the unending wave of Russian forces at its doorstep, and it needed to do so with as much surprise as possible. Thus, Ukraine did the unthinkable. It attacked Russia directly. By proving that it could occupy a piece of Russian territory, Ukraine managed to gather critical acclaim from war councils and strategists worldwide. More importantly, so long as it kept control over the occupied pieces of Kursk, it would have a bargaining chip to use against Russia. The exchange would be simple. In case of peace deals, Russia would retreat from the occupied territories in return for getting parts of Kursk back. This is oversimplifying the peace negotiations a bit, as there would also likely be reparations for the enormous economic and demographic damage Ukraine suffered over these 3 years. Regardless, Ukraine is using Kursk to give itself a bit more bargaining power in any potential peace talks. So why the sudden offensive 6 months after the first one? The answer lies in the new US administration. With Trump in the White House, the US could adopt a slightly different foreign policy than it had over the past 4 years. Previously, Trump had been vocal about his high opinion of Putin, at least before the war started in 2022, and has claimed that Russia and the US are more alike than it seems. Putin has also staunchly supported Trump's campaigns every time, exactly due to the latter's favorable attitude toward Russia. Or at least that's how it used to be before the inauguration in January. Trump's policies haven't taken a sharp turn from Biden's previous ones, yet. The US is still maintaining donations to Ukraine. However, Trump has also been critical of NATO countries, not contributing as much to the organization as they should. This was a major point of contention between the alliance members before the war, as only 3 countries allocated more than the agreed-upon 2% of their GDP to national defense during the 2010s. When it became obvious Russia was a possible threat to Ukraine, Europe as a whole, and possibly further, many countries changed their tune. Germany, the UK, France, Poland, Italy, and many others started putting more and more toward military and national defense. The new additions to the alliance, Sweden and Finland, are also particularly determined to satisfy this requirement from the get-go, and Finland already has a robust military-industrial complex devoted to researching and developing new weapons, as many of its prototypes are based on how donations to Ukraine performed in the war. With this, previous speculation about the US leaving NATO could all but be abandoned, as most of the issues could be solved. But there's also the question of Trump's stance on the war itself. Trump has stated, and multiple times at that he considers the war a practical waste of time and that it should have never happened. He also boldly proclaimed that he had a plan on how to end the war in only a few days, diplomatically at least. However, there are no actual details on Trump's peace deal, leading to plenty of speculation. The running theory is that Trump is working on a 100-day ceasefire that will ultimately stop the war. The plans, which are unconfirmed, have only been leaked by Ukrainian outlets, so take these details with a huge grain of salt. There are a few vital aspects of the plan: the ceasefire, annexing land, and Ukraine's status in international organizations, namely the European Union and NATO. For the ceasefire, the concept is pretty simple. Ukraine and Russia would simply stop the war. NATO would send peacekeeping forces to the regions that are currently on the front line, which would hopefully dissuade further violence. However, the plan's second and third points are rather contentious. First, the rumored plan involves Russia formally annexing all the territory it's claimed and has successfully occupied during the war, which includes much of the Donbas region. Worse yet, Ukraine will be forced to completely retreat from Kursk and cede it back to Russia. Secondly, Ukraine will be reportedly banned from joining NATO entirely, remaining a neutral country, which might not even be true in the long run. As such, under the proposed plan, Ukraine is set to practically lose as much as possible, and the suggestions aren't really that much better than the 2024 Chinese peace plan, which was immediately dismissed by the Ukrainian sources. Of course, there are some positives included in the plan, both for Ukraine and Russia. It was suggested that NATO continue economic donations to aid the reconstruction efforts throughout Ukraine, which were estimated to be around $480 billion, which is still lower than the annual US military budget, mind you. Additionally, Russia would get some of its economic sanctions removed, allowing it to function more normally in international trade. If the plan turns out to be true, it seems horribly lopsided in Russia's favor. With Ukraine bound to lose roughly a fifth of its territory, which is conveniently rich in natural resources and suitable for agriculture, it would be a significant blow to a country that has fought for 3 years to maintain its borders as they were. Therefore, no actual confirmation of the plan has been revealed so far, and it's highly unlikely that both sides would agree to this deal under the current circumstances. But perhaps that's the entire point of the renewed offensive in Kursk. By displaying yet another attempt to push deeper into Russia's territory, this time also successfully, Ukraine doesn't seem to want to give any negotiation advantage to either Russia or the US. And the more pressure Ukraine puts on Kursk, the less likely it is that the Russian military is going to progress on the Donbass front. Kursk is also a potential staging ground for more long-range weaponry. Every mile that the Ukrainian military pushes deeper into Russian territory is another mile into which it can move its long-range systems to take potshots at Moscow itself. With Putin's seat of power in Moscow being threatened, Ukraine hopes that it can end the war or completely exhaust Russia's resources before it runs out of steam and bullets, missiles, and drones. But what do you think? Is Ukraine going to make a more meaningful push into Kursk, or perhaps even target another region altogether? And is there merit to the speculated peace plans? Thanks for watching and leave your comments below. Now go and check out Putin Has Lost, Prepare for the Kremlin's Collapse, or click this other video instead.